He managed, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's quite simple, Mr. Harrington," Diane replied, her tone professional but not unkind. "For the past 3 months, I've been working as a member of the cleaning staff here at Pinnacle. It's how I assess company culture before implementing changes." Murmurs spread around the table as board members processed this revelation. "You were the cleaning lady?" one older board member asked, clearly struggling to reconcile the elegant, confident woman before them with the quiet figure who had emptied his trash bin for months. "I was," Diane confirmed. "And I learned more in those 3 months than I could have in years of financial reports and executive summaries." She opened a leather portfolio and removed several documents, passing them to her advisor to distribute. "This is my comprehensive assessment of Pinnacle Solutions, its strengths, weaknesses, and my plan for turning this company around. But before we discuss that," she turned back to Ted, "please continue your presentation on the Henderson account. I'm genuinely interested." Ted looked down at his notes, then back at Diane. The shock on his face had been replaced by something more complex, embarrassment mingled with fear. Perhaps we should move directly to your assessment," he suggested, his usual confidence completely evaporated. "No, I insist," Diane said firmly. "The Henderson account is a significant achievement. Please tell us how it came about." Swallowing hard, Ted began his presentation, but his earlier bravado was gone. As he spoke about the account, he stumbled over his words, especially when describing the software package that had secured the deal. "The development team created an innovative solution," he admitted, glancing nervously at Diane. "It was their concept from the beginning." When he finished, Diane thanked him and asked him to take his seat. She then rose and moved to the front of the room. "What you've just witnessed," she told the board, "is something rare in business: growth and accountability in real time. The version of this presentation I heard practiced earlier today credited marketing exclusively for landing Henderson. Now we've heard a more accurate account." Ted stared at the table, unable to meet anyone's eyes. "This is actually a perfect segue into what I want to discuss today," Diane continued. "Pinnacle Solutions has excellent products and talented people. What it lacks is a culture of respect, collaboration, and accountability." For the next 30 minutes, Diane outlined what she had observed during her time undercover: the departmental silos, the credit stealing, the disrespect toward support staff, the wasteful spending in some areas while cutting essential services in others. She didn't name individuals, but several executives, Ted included, clearly recognized their own behavior in her examples. "The good news," she said, "is that I've also seen tremendous potential here. I've identified key people at all levels who embody the values that will help Pinnacle thrive." She clicked to a new slide showing a restructuring plan. "Effective immediately. We'll be implementing several changes. First, a walk-in-their-shoes program. Every executive will spend 1 week per quarter working in support positions. Second, we're raising salaries for maintenance and cleaning staff by 15%. Third, we're creating a direct communication channel between all staff levels and leadership." The board members listened attentively, some taking notes, others nodding in agreement. Even Ted seemed to be considering her words carefully. "Additionally," Diane continued, "we'll be restructuring several departments to better align with our new company values." This was the moment everyone had been waiting for: who would stay and who would go. "I believe in second chances," Diane said, making eye contact with Ted. "I've seen people at their worst in this company, but I've also seen moments of growth and kindness from those same individuals. My goal isn't to clean house, but to build a stronger team." She outlined the new organizational structure, which included surprising new roles for several people. Raymond, the head of the cleaning crew, would join the executive team as Director of Facilities and Staff Experience. Several lower-level employees who had demonstrated exceptional skills and character would be promoted. "And Ted, Mr. Harrington," Diane addressed him directly, "you have undeniable talents in marketing and client relations. You also have demonstrated serious lapses in leadership and character." Ted looked up at her, clearly expecting to be fired on the spot. "I'm offering you a choice," Diane continued. "Option 1, a generous severance package. Option 2, remain with Pinnacle in a new role as marketing strategist, reporting to the new VP of Marketing, with the understanding that you'll participate in our mentoring program and demonstrate measurable improvement in how you work with others across all levels." The room was Silent as everyone waited for Ted's response. I would like to stay, he said quietly. I have a lot to learn, it seems, Diane nodded. We all do, Mr. Harrington. That's how we grow. The meeting continued as Diane detailed more of her vision for Pinnacle's future. By the time they broke for lunch, the mood had shifted from tension to cautious optimism. Many board members expressed enthusiasm for her approach, and even those initially skeptical seemed willing to give her methods a chance. As people filed out, Ted approached Diane hesitantly. Ms. Wilson, I owe you an apology, he began, his voice uncharacteristically humble. The way I treated you, the things I said, were enlightening, Diane finished for him. Don't apologize to me, Mr. Harrington, I was there by choice. Instead, consider how you've treated everyone in support roles throughout your career. Ted nodded slowly. I never thought about it that way. It was how things were always done in the companies I worked for. And that's exactly what we're going to change, Diane replied. Breaking cycles requires awareness first, then action. After Ted left, Diane's advisor approached. That was surprisingly merciful, he commented. After what you endured, I half expected you to fire him on the spot. Diane shook her head. This isn't about revenge. It's about building something better. Ted has valuable skills. He just needs to learn that success isn't achieved by climbing over others. After the board meeting concluded, Diane had one more important task. She walked down to the basement where the cleaning staff was having their lunch break. When she entered in her business suit, conversation stopped as people stared in confusion. Hello, everyone, she said warmly. I believe I owe you an explanation. For the next hour, Diane sat with her former colleagues, explaining her undercover role and her plans for the company. There were gasps of surprise, bursts of laughter, and even a few tears, especially from Gloria, who had taken Diane under her wing from day one. So all those times I was complaining about management to you, Gloria said, shaking her head in disbelief, were exactly what I needed to hear, Diane assured her. Your insights were invaluable. When she told them about the 15% raise in the new communication channels, cheers erupted. When she announced that Raymond would be joining the executive team, they applauded and patted him on the back. What about you? Carlos asked. Will we still see you around? My office door will always be open, Diane promised. And don't be surprised if you see me helping with cleaning occasionally. It's actually quite therapeutic. By the end of the day, word had spread throughout Pinnacle about the owner who had worked as a cleaning lady. Some were embarrassed by how they had treated her. Others were curious, and a few were worried about what she might have overheard. As Diane packed up her few belongings from the small locker in the basement, Raymond joined her. Your parents would be proud, he said quietly. Diane looked up in surprise. How did you know about my parents? You mentioned them once, how they worked as janitors and taught you that all work has dignity. It stuck with me because my father was a janitor too. Diane smiled, touching a small photo of her parents she kept in her wallet. They believe that how you treat people when you think no one important is watching reveals your true character. Well, you certainly put that theory to the test, Raymond chuckled. So what happens now? Everything just changes overnight? No, Diane said thoughtfully. Real change takes time. Some people will resist, others will embrace it immediately. Most will fall somewhere in between. But we've taken the first step, showing that everyone in this building matters, from the cleaning staff to the CEO. As they walked out together, employees from all departments were mingling in the lobby, the usual divisions between roles temporarily forgotten in the excitement of the day's events. Diane spotted Ted talking with a group that included members of the development team, a sight she had never witnessed during her time undercover. See? She said to Raymond. It's already beginning. Outside, as the evening sun cast long shadows across the parking lot, Diane looked back at the Pinnacle Solutions building. For 3 months, she had entered through the service entrance in the back. Today she walked out the front door, her step light with the knowledge that tomorrow would be the start of something new. The company name glowed against the darkening sky, Pinnacle Solutions. Today they had taken the first step toward truly living up to that name, toward reaching new heights by lifting everyone together. Diane smiled to herself as she got into her car. Her parents had always told her that one person could change a system from the inside if they had enough courage and commitment. Today proved The morning she first walked into the courtroom, not as a visitor, not as someone called to defend herself, but as someone stepping into the role she had dreamed of for years, felt unlike anything she had ever known. The air was heavy with silence, yet filled with an energy she could almost touch. She paused for a moment at the entrance, her hand brushing against the cool wood of the door, and let her eyes travel across the room. How many times had she sat here on the benches waiting for her name to be called? How many times had she looked at the judge's chair from below, wondering if she would ever reach it? And now it was waiting for her. Her steps were measured as she crossed the room. She could hear the faint shuffling of papers, the coughs of people waiting, the low murmur of voices that always filled these walls. But beneath all of that, she could hear the sound of her own heartbeat, steady and strong. She didn't rush. She let the moment unfold, let herself feel the weight of every step, because she knew this wasn't just about her. It was about every hour she had stayed awake studying when the world slept, every page she had read when others had given up, every time she had been underestimated and kept walking forward anyway. This was the moment when all of that had led her here. When she finally sat down, the chair felt solid beneath her, heavier than she expected. It was not just wood and leather. It was responsibility, it was history. It was a reminder that the decisions made here shaped lives. She placed her hands on the desk before her and took a slow breath. For a brief second, her mind flickered back to those first encounters, to the officer's voice echoing in the courtroom, to the way she had stood with nothing but her words and her knowledge to protect her. That girl who once stood nervously at the side of the room was still inside her, but she had grown into something more. She had kept her promise. The clerk began reading the first case of the day. She listened carefully, her eyes steady, her expression calm. The room was the same as always. Walls lined with shelves, benches filled with nervous faces, officers in uniform standing by the side. But everything felt different now because of where she sat. She realized quickly that being here wasn't about power. It wasn't about proving anyone wrong or about being respected. It was about service. It was about listening with fairness, about protecting the weak, about reminding those who thought their voices didn't matter that they did. As the first case unfolded, she leaned forward slightly, hearing both sides with care. She didn't rush her thoughts. She asked questions gently but directly, making sure the truth had space to rise. And as she spoke her decision, she noticed the way people in the room listened, really listened. Not because of the chair she sat in, but because they felt the honesty in her voice. She wasn't just repeating rules from a book. She was speaking with the same heart that had once defended itself with nothing but courage. Word spread quickly, as it always does. People began to talk about the new face on the bench, the one who listened with patience and spoke with clarity. They said she carried wisdom beyond her years, that she didn't just understand the law, but understood people, and quietly, without seeking it, she became a symbol of what was possible. Those who had once been afraid to step into a courtroom found courage when they saw her there. They thought, if she could come from where she came from and reach this place, then maybe fairness truly did exist. It wasn't always easy. There were long days that stretched into nights, cases that weighed heavy on her heart, decisions that carried pain no matter how fair they were. She felt the burden of it often, the knowledge that her words could change the direction of someone's life. But she carried that burden with the same calm strength she had carried her books years ago. She never let pride take root, never let the chair become more important than the people. She reminded herself daily that justice wasn't about her. It was about those who stood before her. And then came a day she never expected. The officer, the same one who had once doubted her, the one whose words had once tried to overshadow hers, walked into her courtroom again. Time had changed him. His hair had thinned, his shoulders carried a different weight, his eyes held less certainty. He wasn't standing as the voice of accusation this time. He was simply there as part of a case, doing his duty as always. When his eyes lifted and met hers, there was a flicker of recognition, a spark of memory that passed silently between them. He remembered the young woman who had once stood across from him, calm and unshaken, and now he saw her sitting where the judge once sat, speaking with the authority that came not from a uniform, but from years of knowledge and integrity. Their eyes met only for a moment, but it was enough. She saw no resentment in his gaze, only respect, perhaps even admiration. And she in turn felt no need for triumph or revenge. She felt only gratitude, because in some strange way those early clashes had helped shape her. Without his doubts, without his challenges, She might never have had to rise so firmly, never had to prove herself so clearly. He had been part of her journey, even if neither of them had realized it at the time. The case ended and he left quietly, but the moment stayed with her. It reminded her of how far she had come, and of how important it was to treat every person with fairness, even those who once stood against her. That was what true justice meant. Over the years, she continued to serve. She never let the position harden her. She listened to children who trembled when they spoke, to parents who carried the weight of mistakes, to officers who believed they had done right, and to citizens who felt they had been wronged. She heard them all with equal care. She never forgot what it felt like to stand where they stood, uncertain and overlooked. That memory kept her human, kept her heart open. People began to tell her story, sometimes in whispers, sometimes out loud. They spoke of the girl who had once walked into a courtroom as a defendant and later returned as a judge. They spoke of resilience, of quiet determination, of the power of knowledge combined with courage. And though she never sought fame, her story traveled far beyond the walls of her courtroom. It became a reminder that no one should be measured only by where they start, but by how far they are willing to go. One evening, after a long day of hearings, she walked out of the courthouse as the sun was setting. The light painted the sky in shades of gold and red, and for a moment she paused on the steps, watching the glow spread across the city. She thought of the years behind her, the nights of study, the mornings of doubt, the voices that had told her she couldn't, the moments when she nearly believed them, and then she thought of the promise she had made to herself, whispered quietly under a dim lamp, that she would sit in that chair someday. The promise had been kept. But more than that, it had grown into something larger than herself. It had become a promise to others, that justice could be fair, that determination could break barriers, that one voice could carry enough strength to change the way people listened. As the sky darkened, she turned and walked down the steps, her pace steady, her heart calm. She knew there would always be more work, more challenges, more days that tested her strength. But she was ready. She had been ready for years. And now, as she walked into the evening, she carried with her not just the weight of responsibility, but the quiet satisfaction of knowing she had built a life shaped by resilience, guided by truth and anchored in justice. Her story was not about triumph over others. It was not about proving doubters wrong or claiming a seat of power. It was about something far deeper. It was about refusing to let the world define her limits, about holding on to a dream even when it felt too far away, about rising each time the path grew hard. And in the end, it was about giving back, not just to the law she had studied for so long, but to the people who walked into her courtroom every day hoping to be heard. And so, the girl who once stood quietly at the edge of the courtroom now sat at its heart, not as a symbol of victory, but as a reminder of possibility, a reminder that sometimes the most powerful journeys begin not with loud declarations but with a single steady step forward, and that even in the quietest voices, when spoken with truth, there can be enough strength to change everything. The weeks after that second courtroom encounter felt different for her. Though she went about her days as quietly as ever, she still rose early, still carried her books under her arm, still studied long into the night while others slept. But there was something new in the air now, something she couldn't quite name. People looked at her differently when she walked into the courthouse. Clerks gave her small nods as though they already knew who she was. Guards at the doors smiled faintly in recognition. Even strangers sitting in the waiting benches turned their heads when she walked by, curious about the woman who had stood up so firmly in a room where most people's voices shook. She didn't seek the attention, but she understood it. What had happened in that courtroom wasn't common. It had left an impression, not only on the officer but also on everyone who had witnessed it. And the truth was, she hadn't even shown all she knew. That day she had simply defended herself with honesty and clarity. But her life had been built on years of preparation, on long hours of studying the law not just as rules written on paper, but as living principles that shaped lives. The judge had sensed that, and his words, unusual knowledge, echoed in her mind every time she opened her books. It was both a compliment and a sign that she was standing right at the edge of something larger. The next time she appeared in court, there was a slight buzz before her name was called. It wasn't loud, just a subtle energy among the people sitting there. The officer stood in his usual place, though his posture was tighter now, his confidence dimmed. She noticed the way he avoided looking at her, the way his eyes seemed fixed on the papers in his hands as though they were a shield. She walked forward calmly, her steps even, her folder held close. When the judge looked at her, there was something different in his gaze, not just recognition but a flicker of curiosity. He saw not just a defendant but someone who understood the weight of the very chair he sat in. The session began. The officer spoke again, but his words felt thinner than before. He still laid out his report, still tried to paint the picture of what he claimed had happened, but the strength was gone. It was as though he was speaking not to win, but to convince himself he hadn't already lost. She listened quietly as always, never interrupting, never showing impatience. And when it was her turn, she rose with the same calm assurance, her voice steady and clear. This time, though, she did more than defend. She spoke of the law itself, of how it existed not simply to punish but to protect, to guide, to ensure fairness. She explained how even small cases like hers mattered, because they reflected whether justice was being served or ignored. The courtroom grew quiet as she spoke, her words flowing not like a rehearsed speech but like something living inside her. She wasn't trying to impress anyone. She was simply telling the truth as she saw it, and the truth carried weight on its own. The judge leaned forward, listening intently. The officer shifted uncomfortably, glancing at her and then quickly away. Even the people waiting for their own hearing seemed to forget their nerves for a moment, drawn into her words. When she finished, there was a silence that stretched longer than usual. The judge tapped his pen lightly against the desk, his eyes steady on her. And then, in a tone that carried both curiosity and respect, he asked, "You've studied the law for quite some time, haven't you?" She met his gaze and nodded. "Yes, sir," she replied simply. "It's been my path for many years." The judge's brow lifted slightly. "And where does that path lead?" It was an unusual question for a courtroom, one that had nothing to do with the case at hand. But in that moment, the formality of the room seemed to soften. He wasn't just a judge speaking to a defendant. He was a man recognizing something in another person, something rare. She hesitated for a moment, not out of doubt, but out of respect for the space she was in. Then she answered, her voice calm but carrying quiet strength. "I hope it leads to serving justice from the other side of this bench, sir. That is where I want to be." The words seemed to hang in the air. People turned their heads. Murmurs rippled softly through the benches, and even the officer blinked in surprise. The judge's expression didn't change much, but his eyes carried a spark now, the kind of spark that shows a thought has taken root. He didn't respond right away. Instead, he leaned back slowly, studying her, weighing the truth of her words. Finally, he nodded once, a small but powerful gesture, and said, "Then perhaps this place is already teaching you." The hearing continued, but the mood had changed completely. The officer's words no longer filled the room with authority. They seemed small compared to what had just been revealed. She answered calmly when called upon, and though the case itself was minor, everyone knew the day wasn't about a traffic violation anymore. It was about something larger, something unfolding right in front of them. When the session ended, she gathered her things quietly as she always did. But as she turned to leave, the judge called her name once more. She stopped, surprised, and looked back. His voice was measured, carrying the weight of someone who chose words carefully. "Continue your studies. This court needs people who understand not just the law, but the heart behind it." He didn't smile, but his eyes held warmth. Then he dismissed her with a small wave of his hand. She walked out of the courtroom that day with her heart beating faster than usual. The officer didn't look at her as she passed, his face pale with unease. Outside, the air felt brighter, sharper, as if the world itself had shifted slightly. She knew the road ahead of her was still long. There were exams to pass, years of work to put in, and countless challenges waiting. But now the path was no longer invisible. Others could see it too. The judge had seen it, the people in that courtroom had seen it, and even the officer who once dismissed her had been forced to see it. That night, she sat at her desk again, but this time her books felt different under her hands. They weren't just tools for learning anymore. They were steps toward the seat she had spoken of aloud for the first time. She thought of the judge's words, of the way he had told her this place was already teaching her. He was right. Every moment in that courtroom had been a lesson, not just about laws and rules, but about people, about truth, about the courage to speak even when underestimated. The days turned into weeks, the weeks into months, and still she studied. She worked harder than ever, Not because she needed to prove herself to anyone, but because she had made a promise to herself. She would not waste the recognition she had been given. She would rise to meet it. She carried the memory of those courtroom moments with her everywhere she went. The way the officer's voice had faltered, the way the people had leaned in to listen, the way the judge had asked her where her path led. These weren't just memories. They were reminders that she belonged in the place she was walking toward. The officer, on the other hand, carried a different memory. For him, it was not inspiration but a lesson in humility. He had walked into that courtroom certain of himself, certain of the power his uniform carried. But he had walked out reminded that knowledge and truth could stand taller than authority alone. Perhaps he never admitted it to anyone else, but deep down, he knew he had been changed by those encounters. And though his pride stung, perhaps it also left him with a new kind of respect for the people he had once overlooked. As for her, she no longer cared much for how others saw her. She cared only for the promise she had spoken aloud, the dream she had been carrying quietly for so many years. The dream of sitting in that chair not as someone defending herself, but as someone listening, guiding, and delivering justice fairly. And as she closed her books late that night, her lamp casting a soft glow over the pages, she whispered to herself once again, someday soon, she would not just walk into a courtroom. She would sit at its very heart, and she would make sure no one else was ever underestimated the way she had been. The day of her next appearance in the courtroom carried a different kind of weight. The hallways were the same, the benches filled with people waiting their turn, the soft buzz of voices mixing with the sound of footsteps echoing against the walls. But for her, the air felt charged. It wasn't fear or nerves that filled her, but a strange sense that this day would push her further into the path she had been walking quietly for years. She didn't know exactly how, but she could feel something waiting for her beyond the doors. When she stepped inside, the officer was already there. His posture was stiff, his eyes fixed on a folder he held, though she noticed how tightly his hand gripped the edge of it. He had seen her before. He had faced her words before, and now he seemed more guarded. Gone was the smug grin he had once worn, the look of certainty that nothing could shake him. Now he seemed almost cautious, as though bracing for a storm. She walked calmly to her seat, her folder tucked under her arm, her step steady. She didn't look at him for long, just enough to see the shift in his demeanor, and then she looked ahead. When the session began, the judge's voice filled the room, measured and firm. The early cases passed quickly, people stepping up nervously, speaking in half-whispers, agreeing to fines or asking for extensions. But when her name was called, the energy shifted. People seemed to sit a little straighter, as though remembering what had happened the last time she stood there. Even those who didn't know her story leaned in, sensing that something different was about to unfold. The officer spoke first again, but this time his voice was slower, careful. He laid out his version of events with more detail than before, as though trying to cover every corner of the picture he was painting. He mentioned distances, times, and even the speed of her car, though his words still carried the stiffness of someone who was rehearsing rather than recalling. She listened, eyes steady on him, her face calm. Inside, she was noting every line, every claim, and she could see already where the holes would appear. The more he spoke, the clearer it became that his account was built not on memory but on habit, the repetition of a story he thought would always work. When it was her turn, she rose with quiet confidence. She didn't rush. She began with simple details, describing again how she had stopped, how the other vehicle had moved before she continued, how the line of sight at the intersection could easily mislead someone not paying full attention. Her words weren't filled with emotion. They were filled with clarity. Each sentence landed with weight because she spoke only what she knew to be true. The judge leaned forward, his eyes on her, his expression unreadable but intent. Then came the moment that shifted the room. The judge asked her a question, not a small one, not about her car or the stop sign, but about the specific law surrounding the violation. It wasn't a question usually asked of someone defending themselves. It was technical, precise, the kind of question that would unsettle even a seasoned lawyer. The room went quiet, waiting for her response. She didn't flinch. She answered clearly, citing the rule as though it had been written on the inside of her mind, explaining not just what it said, but why it existed, why the law required such detail. Her voice never wavered, and when she finished, there was no doubt in anyone's mind that she hadn't just memorized the words, she understood them. A ripple of surprise passed through the room. Even the officer shifted uncomfortably, his jaw tightening as if he had just realized he was standing on thinner ground than he had thought. The judge's gaze lingered on her a moment longer, and then he nodded slowly, tapping his pen once against the desk. That single motion, small as it was, felt louder than any words. It was recognition. It was the kind of acknowledgement that most people spend years waiting to receive. The officer tried to speak again, tried to add to his testimony, but his voice no longer carried the same weight. He repeated himself, circled around the same points, and the more he did, the more it became clear that he was struggling to hold on to control of the narrative. She didn't interrupt, didn't argue. She waited until she was given the chance to respond, and then she simply pointed out with precision the contradictions between his words and the evidence. She didn't need to raise her voice. Truth spoken steadily can be sharper than any shout. The judge finally raised his hand to silence the room. His expression was calm, but his eyes were sharp, fixed on the officer in a way that made even those watching from the benches shift in their seats. Then he turned to her again, and for a long moment the room was quiet. She held his gaze, not with challenge but with respect, waiting. Then, in a voice that carried across the room, the judge said, "Your knowledge of the law is unusual for someone standing here in this position." A murmur spread among the people sitting behind her. The officer's face flushed slightly, though he looked down to hide it. She simply nodded, answering, "I have studied it for years, sir." Her voice was calm, almost humble, but the truth in her words filled the air. The judge didn't press further. He simply leaned back, his expression unreadable, though his silence carried meaning. Everyone in that room could sense it. When the session ended, people filed out slowly, whispering to one another. Some glanced at her as they passed, curiosity written across their faces. She gathered her things quietly and walked toward the exit. Outside, the sun was bright, the air crisp, but her thoughts were heavier than the air around her. She knew something had shifted, not just in that courtroom, but in the way she was being seen. The judge's words still echoed in her mind, unusual knowledge. It was a compliment, but also a sign that the path she was walking was becoming visible to others now, not just to herself. As she reached her car, she caught sight of the officer again. He stood a few yards away, speaking to another officer, his expression tight. He looked up briefly, saw her, and for a second their eyes met. There was no arrogance in his gaze anymore, no smirk. Instead, there was unease, perhaps even regret. He looked away quickly, muttering something to his colleague before turning his back. She didn't linger. She unlocked her car, slid inside, and sat for a moment before starting the engine. Her hands rested on the wheel, steady as ever, but her heart carried the quiet fire of someone who had just stepped closer to the place they were meant to be. That night, she lay awake longer than usual, staring at the ceiling. Her mind replayed the judge's question, her answer, the silence that followed. She thought about the years she had spent working toward her dream, the sacrifices, the doubts, the nights she had wondered if it was all worth it. And now here she was, being recognized in the very setting where she hoped to one day belong. It wasn't the final step, but it was a signpost along the way, one that told her she was moving in the right direction. She smiled faintly in the darkness, a smile of quiet determination, and whispered to herself the promise she had carried for so long. One day, she would not just stand in a courtroom defending herself, she would sit at the front, guiding justice for others. The world didn't change overnight. She still woke up the next morning, still followed her routine, still studied late into the night. But she carried herself differently now. When she walked into rooms, people noticed. When she spoke, they listened a little more carefully. And though she never bragged, never raised her voice, the weight of her knowledge was beginning to show in every step she took. The officer, on the other hand, carried the memory of being challenged, of standing across from someone he had dismissed too quickly. For him, it was a lesson. For her, it was a beginning. And both of them knew deep down that this was not the last time their paths would cross. The air in the courtroom felt heavier when she finished speaking. There was no sound for a few seconds, only the quiet shuffle of papers and the tap of the judge's pen. It wasn't dramatic silence like in movies, but the kind of pause that tells everyone in the room that something unusual has just happened. People shifted in their seats. The officer cleared his throat and looked down at his notes as if trying to remember the lines he had rehearsed. but the confidence he carried when he first entered had already slipped away. He had expected an easy path, a routine case, but she had turned the atmosphere in the room with nothing more than calm words and unshaken truth. The judge asked her a few more questions, simple but precise ones. She answered them all with the same steady tone, never rushing, never hesitating. When the officer was asked to respond, he repeated his claim, but this time his voice didn't sound as firm. He spoke faster, his sentences shorter, and every time she raised her head slightly and looked at him, he avoided her eyes. It was not aggression in her gaze, only confidence, but sometimes confidence is enough to disarm someone who depends on authority alone. As the minutes passed, the judge leaned back in his chair, watching both of them carefully. There was something almost curious in his expression, as if he wasn't just judging a case anymore but also weighing something else, something deeper. The other people in the courtroom seemed to sense it too. They had come for their own reasons, tickets or hearings, but now they were drawn into a story that felt larger than a simple violation. They were watching a kind of duel, not of anger but of knowledge, where words were sharper than any weapon. She could feel the shift happening. It wasn't victory she felt, at least not yet. It was something subtler, the realization that truth, when spoken without fear, had its own kind of power. She had seen this before in classrooms, in debates, in study halls late at night when she had argued her way through case studies. But this was different. This was real, this was lived, and here in this small courtroom, she was no longer just a student of law. She was living it, step by step. The officer tried again to hold his ground, describing angles and movements as though painting a picture of certainty. But the more he spoke, the more it became clear that he hadn't noticed every detail, hadn't considered every factor. He was repeating the same frame he had given dozens of times before, expecting it to fit, but it didn't match this situation. She listened with quiet patience and, when given the chance, pointed out the gaps. Her words weren't sharp or mocking, just simple facts. Facts have a way of speaking louder than pride ever can. The judge finally raised a hand, signaling that he had heard enough. The officer stopped mid-sentence, his jaw tightening, and the room fell into silence again. The judge looked at her, then at the officer, and then back at her. There was no immediate decision, but there was recognition. The kind of recognition that doesn't need to be spoken, at least not yet. She nodded politely and stepped back, waiting. The hearing continued with other cases, but the energy in the room had shifted. People whispered quietly when she walked past to return to her seat. A few gave her small, encouraging smiles as if they had just witnessed something rare. Even though they didn't know her story, they knew they had seen someone stand tall against assumption. She didn't smile back, not out of coldness, but because her mind was already moving ahead. She wasn't thinking about attention or admiration. She was thinking about what this moment meant for her journey. Later, when she stepped outside the courthouse, the cool air hit her face and she took a deep breath. The world outside was still the same. Cars moved down the street, people rushed by, life went on. But something inside her had shifted. She had walked into that building as someone defending herself against a small charge, but she had walked out as someone who had proven, to herself and to others, that she belonged in places where truth was weighed. That feeling, more than anything, stayed with her as she walked down the steps. The officer, too, walked out not long after. For a brief moment, their eyes met across the parking lot. He didn't say a word, didn't nod or acknowledge her, but the look on his face was different from the one he had worn earlier. It wasn't arrogance anymore. It was something between unease and reluctant respect. The look of someone who had underestimated a person and didn't quite know how to process being wrong. She didn't linger on it. She turned away, walked to her car, and drove off, her hands steady on the wheel. That night, she sat at her desk with papers spread out before her. Not tickets or reports, but books, notes, and study material. Her dream was larger than the courtroom she had stepped into that day. She was on a path that stretched years behind her, and even more years ahead. She remembered the long nights of reading, the endless pages of law texts, the practice exams, the debates that had sharpened her mind. She remembered the sacrifices, too. Missing gatherings, staying home when others went out, working jobs that barely paid enough just so she could stay close to her dream. Every step had led her here, to the moment where she had stood in front of a judge and realized she could one day be in his place. It wasn't arrogance. She didn't think of herself as someone who deserved power simply because she was smart. She thought of justice, of fairness, of the countless times she had seen people dismissed because they looked too ordinary, because someone assumed they didn't belong. She thought of her own family, of friends who had been silenced because they didn't know how to speak up in the right way. And she thought of herself, standing in that courtroom, proving that even one voice could shift the balance when it carried truth. In the days that followed, whispers spread quietly. Courtrooms are small places in some towns, and stories travel fast. People spoke of the young woman who had walked in calm and left stronger, the one who had made an officer hesitate with nothing more than words. Some admired her. Some were skeptical, but everyone remembered her. She didn't care much for the talk. She cared only that she had been true to herself and to the law she respected. But still, the talk had its own weight. It meant that when she returned, she would not be seen the same way again. The next time she stepped into that courthouse, the air felt different. The guards at the door gave her a nod of familiarity. The clerks looked at her with recognition. Even the judge, when his eyes met hers, gave a brief glance that carried more meaning than words. She wasn't just another face in the crowd anymore. She was someone who had left a mark. The officer, on the other hand, carried himself differently now. He didn't smirk when he entered. He didn't rush through his words. He looked cautious, careful, as if measuring every step. Maybe he didn't want to face her again. Maybe he didn't want to be reminded of the moment when his certainty had crumbled in front of strangers. Either way, the balance had changed. Respect doesn't always come easily, but once earned, it leaves a lasting shadow. For her, though, the true weight of what happened didn't come from pride or attention. It came from the reminder that knowledge, when paired with courage, can change the course of any moment. She didn't feel larger than life. She felt grounded, more certain than ever of why she had chosen the path she was on. And as she walked out of the courthouse again, she could almost see it. The chair at the front, the seat that carried the responsibility of listening to every voice, of weighing every truth. It wasn't hers yet, but she knew it would be someday. And when it was, she would remember exactly how it felt to be underestimated. And she would never let that happen to anyone who stood in front of her seeking justice. It was a clear morning when she left home. Not in a hurry, not too relaxed, just in that balance people carry when they have things to do but still want to enjoy the day. She had been driving along the road that led out of town, her window slightly open so the breeze could move through the car. The hum of traffic wasn't too heavy, and she had music playing softly in the background. It was the kind of morning that made her feel like the world was in rhythm, that maybe life would follow her plans without much interruption. She didn't know, of course, that in just a few minutes, she would be pulled over and her life would take a turn that most people could never predict. The flashing blue and red lights in her rear-view mirror startled her. She slowed down, carefully steering to the side. There was no panic in her movements, only a kind of calm because she knew she had done nothing wrong. At worst, maybe she had rolled just slightly too close to the stop sign, or perhaps the officer was checking random cars that morning. She parked safely, switched off her engine, and waited. The officer walked over with a stride that carried authority, the kind of walk that shows he expected to be respected simply because of his uniform. He leaned down slightly, peering through her window with narrowed eyes. His tone was clipped, sharp, and without greeting he said, "License and registration." She reached calmly into her bag, pulled out her documents, and handed them over. He barely glanced at her before looking over the papers, shaking his head like he had already decided something. "You know why I stopped you?" he asked. His voice had a note of challenge in it, like he was daring her to argue. She shook her head gently and said, "I'm not sure, officer." He smirked as if her answer only confirmed what he thought of her. He explained in a slow, patronizing tone that she had failed to fully stop at the last sign. The way he spoke made it sound as though she didn't know the rules of the road, as if he were speaking to someone who couldn't possibly understand how laws worked. She listened quietly, nodding as he spoke, but inside her mind she was already replaying the moment she had stopped. She remembered clearly pressing the brake, waiting for a passing car, then moving again. It wasn't arrogance that made her confident. It was simply the truth. She had followed the rules, but the officer had already made up his mind. He wrote out a ticket quickly, almost as though he had been waiting all morning to hand one out. As he passed it through her window, he gave her a look that seemed to say, "Don't bother fighting this, you won't win." She took the paper, glanced at it, and then folded it neatly before placing it in her bag. She didn't argue. She didn't raise her voice. She simply thanked him, which surprised him enough that his eyebrows lifted for a second before he stepped away and walked back to his car. She drove off slowly, still calm on the surface, but her thoughts were already running ahead. She knew this wasn't just about a ticket. It was about how she had been spoken to, how she had been dismissed before she even had a chance to speak. And if there was one thing she had promised herself long ago, it was that no one would silence her when the truth was on her side. The following week, she prepared for her court date. Most people treat traffic court as a nuisance, something they want to get over with quickly. But for her, it wasn't about convenience. She had studied the law, lived with it, worked alongside it, and she respected it more than anything. She knew how the system worked, knew its flaws, and also knew how to navigate it better than most. That day, she dressed not to impress but to show respect, to the court, to the judge, and to herself. A simple, professional outfit, her hair neatly tied back, her papers organized in a folder she carried under her arm. Walking toward the courthouse, she felt steady, like someone stepping into a place where she belonged. Inside the courtroom, there was the usual quiet buzz of voices before the session began. People sat nervously, some flipping through their tickets, some whispering to friends or family who had come along. She took her seat alone, calmly watching the room. When the officer walked in, she noticed his confidence. He stood tall, nodding to someone at the front, carrying himself like this was routine. To him, it probably was. He had done this dozens of times, maybe hundreds. To him, this was just another person who would plead their case, lose, and leave with a fine. But he didn't know her. Not yet. When her name was called, she stood and walked forward. She could feel the eyes in the room on her, some curious, some sympathetic, and one pair, those of the officer, filled with quiet arrogance. He gave a little half-smile as though he were already celebrating a win. She met his gaze briefly, then looked away. She wasn't here to match his pride with pride of her own. She was here for truth. The judge asked the officer to give his statement first. He spoke with practiced ease, describing how she had rolled through the stop sign, how he had observed it clearly, and how he had no doubt about his report. He didn't stumble over words, didn't hesitate, and for someone who didn't know the law, his account would have sounded flawless. She listened carefully, nodding slightly as if she were agreeing, but in reality, she was marking every small detail he was getting wrong. She had learned long ago that sometimes the most powerful tool in any courtroom wasn't speaking. It was listening. When it was her turn, she stepped forward, her folder in hand. Her voice was calm, steady, not defensive, but clear. She described the same moment the officer had spoken of, only this time with the details he had left out. She explained the car that had passed before she moved again, the angle of the stop sign, the exact line where her tires had rested before she advanced. She even mentioned the other driver who had been behind her at the time, though she knew the court might not bother to track down that witness. The important thing was precision, and she gave it. As she spoke, she noticed the shift in the room. The judge leaned forward slightly, listening more closely. A few people in the gallery looked up from their own papers, curious now about this woman who wasn't trembling, who wasn't begging for leniency, but who was instead speaking with a kind of quiet authority. Even the